Hello, and welcome to The Brief Insight, your go to podcast for breaking down the latest trends, research, and policies shaping our world. Whether you're passionate about sustainability, global economics, or emerging innovations, this is where we simplify complex ideas to keep you informed and inspired. If you enjoy what you hear, don't forget to like this episode, subscribe to our channel, and share it with anyone looking for insights that matter. We're here every Monday and Friday, so hit that notification bell to stay updated. Your support helps us grow and continue bringing you sharp, relevant content that sparks conversation. Thank you for tuning into The Brief Insight. Now let's dive into today's topic.
Welcome to our deep dive. Today, we're tackling the world of cannabis. We've got two great sources to help us unpack this: the PBS Novia documentary, The Cannabis Question, and the Handbook of Cannabis Therapeutics.
It's a really interesting time to be looking into cannabis. It's moving so fast from being illegal to being almost like everyday life. It's a huge shift.
It is, but the documentary makes a point that we're kind of stuck in the middle. On one hand, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry now, and on the other hand, they say someone's getting arrested for cannabis every 58 seconds in the U.S.
Yeah, that's a real head-scratcher, right?
Yeah.
It just shows how complicated the legal and social stuff around cannabis still is.
For sure. To really get this, I think we need to move past that simple question of, is it good or bad? The documentary starts by introducing us to Sam, a young boy who had really bad epilepsy.
Oh, Sam's story is powerful. It really shows how much potential cannabis has for treatment. His seizures went down so much with CBD treatment. And the documentary even explains the science behind it, how CBD actually works on the brain to reduce seizures.
That's wild. It makes you think, right? If our bodies have this whole endocannabinoid system, this ECS, that reacts to cannabis, it must mean something about how we're connected to this plant.
Yeah, it's a question researchers are still trying to figure out. But we know for sure that the ECS is super important. It's like a control system for all sorts of things in our bodies, from stress to sleep, even like how we move.
And get this, the first endocannabinoid they found in our bodies is called anandamide, which actually means bliss in Sanskrit. So our bodies make a bliss molecule naturally. What happens when we add cannabis to that?
Now that's where it gets really interesting. The Handbook of Cannabis Therapeutics goes deep on this. It talks about all these compounds in the cannabis plant called phytocannabinoids and how they mess with our ECS. The two most famous ones are THC and CBD, but there are many others.
So it's not just about getting high then. There's a whole other level of stuff happening in our bodies when we use cannabis.
Exactly. And that's where we really need to understand how THC and CBD are different. They both work on the ECS, but they do it in different ways.
Okay, let's break that down. We know THC is what gets you high, the psychoactive part of cannabis. But what about CBD? Everyone talks about how good it is for you.
The handbook really digs into all the ways CBD can be used for treatment. Anxiety, depression, chronic pain, even epilepsy like we saw with Sam. They think it works because it interacts with these different receptors all over the brain and body, kind of fine-tuning lots of processes.
That's incredible. But if CBD is so good for epilepsy, why is there still so much debate about medical cannabis?
Well, part of it is because of the history, right? Cannabis has been like the bad guy for so long. The handbook actually has a really cool section on the history of cannabis, showing how people's opinions and even the laws have changed so much over time.
It's almost like we're playing catch-up, trying to make sense of all this new science about cannabis after years of believing all the wrong stuff.
Exactly. And to make it even more complicated, while CBD seems really promising, THC does come with some risks, especially for young people's brains.
Right. The documentary makes this point about THC, saying it acts like a hammer on the ECS. They warn that it could mess with how teenagers' brains develop. But alcohol is bad for teenagers' brains too. Why is it different for cannabis?
That's a good point. And it brings up that whole issue of how the laws are all over the place and how the war on drugs has really hurt certain communities more than others. It makes you wonder if the things we worry about with cannabis are really because of science, or if it's more about deeper social and political anxieties that we have.
This is honestly making me rethink everything I thought I knew about cannabis. It's definitely not a simple good or bad thing. There's so much to consider.
Absolutely. And we haven't even talked about the entourage effect yet, this idea that all the compounds in cannabis work together to create different effects. We'll get into that later, but it just shows how much more there is to cannabis than we might realize.
So, thinking back to Sam's story, it sounds like CBD was the key to his treatment. But could those other compounds in the cannabis plant have helped him too?
That's a really interesting question, and researchers are working on figuring that out. The handbook talks about using whole plant extracts, where you get all the cannabinoids and terpenes together to treat different conditions.
It feels like we're just starting to understand all that this plant can do.
It's a really exciting area of research with tons of potential.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it, how much we're still learning about cannabis. And, going through all this research, it really hits you how different everyone's experience with cannabis can be.
It's true. What works for one person might not do a thing for someone else. It's like what we saw in the documentary about cannabis and mental health. They had some pretty surprising stuff about teenagers using cannabis.
Yeah, some of the research was a little worrying. Like, there were studies that showed teenagers who use cannabis can actually have brains that are structured differently, like a thicker cerebral cortex.
That's the outer layer of the brain, right? The one that handles, like, thinking and stuff. Exactly. And it seems these structural changes were linked to problems with learning and memory. So it definitely makes you think twice about using cannabis early on.
I see what you mean, but then the handbook talks about how cannabinoids could be used to treat anxiety and depression. So how do we make sense of that? It seems like two opposite things.
Right. It all goes back to what we were saying before. Treatment needs to be personalized. Things like your genes, your medical history, what specific problem you're trying to solve, even the type of cannabis you're using, it all matters.
So you can't just say cannabis is good or bad for mental health. It all depends.
That's it. And it shows why it's so important to talk to a doctor or someone who knows about cannabis if you're thinking of using it, especially for mental health stuff.
And speaking of being honest, we got to talk about the war on drugs. It's messed up so many lives. The documentary tells this story of Sean Worsley, a veteran who uses medical cannabis for his PTSD. And even though it was legal where he lived, he got arrested for having it in another state.
Sean's story is just heartbreaking. It shows how these messed up laws and the stigma around cannabis can actually put people in jail, people who are just trying to feel better. We need better drug policies that are about helping people, not punishing them.
Totally agree. The handbook gets into this too, talking about how the laws have actually stopped research and made it harder for people to get treatments that could really change their lives.
It's been a huge obstacle for science. The handbook actually has a whole history of how cannabis has been used, and it goes way back thousands of years of people using it for medicine.
Wow, that's crazy. Makes you wonder why people are still so scared of it today.
It's a mix of things.
Absolutely.
Social stuff, politics, economics. It's complicated. But one thing's for sure. We got to move past these old ideas and look at cannabis based on science, not fear.
Okay, so we've talked about medical uses, but
Uh-huh.
let's be real. A lot of people just use cannabis for fun. The documentary mentions all these different kinds of cannabis strains they're making now. Why is that happening?
I think part of it is what people want. Now that more people are interested in cannabis, they're looking for specific effects, specific experiences. And the people who grow cannabis are trying to meet that demand by making all these different strains.
It's kind of like how everyone's into craft beer now, but with cannabis.
Exactly. People are getting picky about their cannabis, and the growers are getting really good at making strains with different smells, tastes, even different effects.
The handbook goes deep on this too. It explains how all these cannabinoids and terpenes work together to create these crazy different effects. It's mind-blowing. So it's not just about getting high anymore. People are looking for specific things, and the growers are actually delivering.
You got it. Some people want something that'll help them relax. Others want something to boost their creativity, maybe help them focus. It's like this mix of science and art happening with how they're growing cannabis.
But with this whole industry growing so fast, what are some of the problems that need to be addressed?
One of the biggest ones, and the documentary brings this up, is responsible regulation. More and more people are trying cannabis, so we got to make sure the stuff out there is safe and good quality.
Right, got to protect people from bad products or like false advertising.
Exactly. People need to know what they're getting. And of course, anytime you have a new industry blowing up, you got to worry about people getting exploited. We need to make sure everyone benefits from cannabis being legal and that it doesn't just help a few people get rich while hurting others.
That's so important. Making cannabis legal should be about making things fair, not just about making money.
I agree, and it's something we need to keep talking about, making sure everyone's voice is heard.
Now, this is something I'm really curious about. Can cannabis be used for serious stuff like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's? The documentary follows these researchers who are looking at how cannabinoids might protect brain cells and maybe even slow down those diseases. Is there any proof that this could work?
Actually, the handbook has a whole section on this. It goes through all these studies that are looking at whether cannabinoids can protect the brain.
So what are they finding?
Well, there's more and more evidence that cannabinoids can reduce inflammation in the brain, oxidative stress, even cell death. And all those things contribute to brain diseases.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. But I guess we need more research before we can say for sure if cannabis can actually help with those diseases.
Definitely. It's still early, but the results so far are really promising. Just imagine if we could use cannabis-based medicines to prevent or delay these awful diseases.
That would be huge. It gives me hope that we might be on the verge of some major breakthroughs in how we treat these
It's
diseases.
definitely a really exciting area of research with so much potential.
Okay, we've talked about the potential benefits for physical conditions, but what about mental health? The documentary seemed a bit unsure about using cannabis for anxiety, depression, and PTSD. Some people said it helped, others said it made things worse.
Yeah, and that's because the science is still being figured out. The handbook talks about how cannabinoids mess with the brain's reward system, which can be both good and bad. It can be therapeutic, but it can also be addictive.
So, cannabis is like a double edged sword when it comes to mental health. It could help, but it could also hurt.
That's a good way to put it. It's really about figuring out the right treatment for each person and being careful if you're using cannabis for mental health stuff. And of course, you got to try to deal with the root cause of the problem, not just mask it with cannabis.
Sounds like you got to find that balance.
For sure. And it's a balance that needs careful thought and a good understanding of the risks and benefits.
I'm also fascinated by how cannabis has been used throughout history and in different cultures. The documentary showed how cannabis was woven into all these different societies, used for medicine, spirituality, all sorts of things.
The handbook is amazing for that. It has this whole historical timeline, tracing cannabis use from ancient civilizations to today. It's crazy to see how cannabis has played so many roles: religious rituals, pain relief, even making textiles.
It's mind-blowing how long we've had this connection with this plant.
Yeah, it shows how versatile it is and how much humans have always been interested in exploring different states of consciousness and finding connection.
But even with this long history, cannabis is still super controversial. The documentary got into the whole legalization debate, showing different sides of how it could affect society.
It's a tough one, no easy answers. The handbook breaks down the whole thing. The laws, the regulations, how it's enforced. It shows how hard it is to make laws that protect people, but also give them freedom.
So we're still figuring out how to handle legal cannabis.
We are. And it's going to take everyone working together, scientists, politicians, people in the industry, communities, to make sure it's done in a way that benefits everyone.
On the topic of innovation, the documentary had some really cool stuff about how cannabis research and products are changing.
Yeah, the cannabis industry is exploding right now. Scientists are getting better at isolating and making specific cannabinoids and terpenes. They're using that to make new products that have really specific effects.
That's amazing. So we're moving beyond just like smoking or eating cannabis. It's
Definitely.
becoming more like medicine.
Exactly. The handbook talks about this too. They say we're heading towards a future where you can get cannabis products that are personalized just for you based on your needs and what you want.
Wow, imagine that. A cannabis product made just for you to help with your specific health problems or goals.
That's the dream. And researchers are also working on new ways to take cannabis and new formulas that make it work better and have fewer risks.
Sounds like the possibilities are endless. But let's get real for a second. There's also the issue of cannabis addiction. How big of a problem is that?
The documentary tackles that head on. They look at the science of how people can get dependent on cannabis, but what makes someone more likely to have problems with it.
So it's not something to ignore.
Definitely not. The handbook has all the latest research on cannabis addiction, how common it is, who's at risk, how to treat it.
But it's important to remember that most people who use cannabis don't have any problems, right?
True. But you always got to be careful and use cannabis responsibly, because anything that can change how you feel has the potential for abuse.
This is making me realize how much there is to the whole cannabis conversation. You can't just put everyone and every experience in the same box.
Exactly. It's about respecting people's choices, talking openly, and basing our understanding on facts, not fear or stigma.
Okay, so we've covered THC and CBD, but what about all the other stuff in cannabis? The documentary talked about terpenes, the things that give cannabis its smell and taste. What do they do?
Oh, terpenes are way more than just smells. They actually work with the cannabinoids to create those different effects we were talking about. It's like another layer of complexity.
So they can actually change how cannabis makes you feel.
That's right. Some terpenes are thought to make you more relaxed. Others might help you focus or be more creative. It's like adding different spices to a dish, creating a whole new flavor profile and experience.
That's really cool. The handbook actually has a whole list of the most common terpenes found in cannabis, explaining what each one does and how it might be useful for your health.
It's a great resource for anyone who wants to dive deeper into the world of terpenes and how they contribute to the whole cannabis experience.
I'm also thinking about the ethical side of using cannabis, especially when it comes to like pregnant women or teenagers. The documentary mentioned that there might be risks for them.
Absolutely. Those are really important things to think about. The handbook talks about the tough choices doctors face when advising patients about cannabis, especially when we don't have all the answers yet. It's a tricky balance between individual rights and what's best for society as a whole.
So we need more research to know for sure what the long-term effects of cannabis are, especially on young people's brains.
For sure. We got to be careful and focus on minimizing any potential harm.
Okay, we've talked about the science, the history, the good and the bad, but what about how cannabis affects society and culture? The documentary showed how the ban on cannabis has really hurt certain communities, especially people of color.
It's a really important part of the conversation. The handbook gives a lot of background on how the ban on cannabis happened and how it's been used to keep certain groups down.
So, making cannabis legal isn't just about giving people freedom, it's also about fixing the mistakes of the past and making things fairer.
Absolutely. It's about getting rid of systems that oppress people and making sure everyone has a chance to benefit from cannabis, whether it's for medicine, recreation, or even making a living.
This really shows how important it is to look at cannabis from all angles.
Exactly. You got to see how individual experiences, social justice, environmental stuff, and our growing understanding of this plant all fit together.
Speaking of the environment, the documentary also talked about how hard it is to grow cannabis in a way that's good for the planet. What are some of the concerns there?
The impact on the environment is a big worry as more cannabis is being grown. The handbook gets into this too, talking about things like how much water and energy it takes and what to do with the waste.
So it's not just about planting a seed and letting it grow. There are consequences for the environment.
That's right. But the good news is that people are coming up with new ways to do it better, like organic farming, closed-loop systems, and using renewable energy.
That's good to hear. It seems like the people in the cannabis industry are starting to think about sustainability, which is really important for the future.
Definitely a step in the right direction.
Mm.
And as the industry grows, we need to make sure they keep caring for the environment.
Now, let's talk about something a little more fun, cannabis and food. The documentary showed chefs doing some amazing things with cannabis in their cooking.
It's pretty cool to see how cannabis is finding its way into the kitchen, adding something new to old recipes and creating totally new flavors.
The handbook even has a guide to cooking with cannabis, with stuff like how to decarboxylate it, infuse it into oils and butter, and figure out how much to use.
Yeah, it's great for anyone who wants to try cooking with cannabis.
But I bet getting the dose right is super important with edibles. You don't want to accidentally eat too much and get way too high.
You got that right. Getting the dose right is key to having a good and safe experience with edibles.
The documentary also explored how cannabis is used in art and music. It's inspiring to see artists and musicians using cannabis to express themselves in new ways and challenge the status quo.
The handbook talks about how cannabis and creativity have always been connected, looking at its influence on different art movements and cultural trends throughout history.
So cannabis has a long history of sparking imagination and inspiring new art.
It does. And as cannabis becomes more accepted, I think we'll see it showing up more and more in art, music, writing, all forms of creative expression.
This whole deep dive has been eye-opening. I'm honestly starting to see cannabis in a whole new light.
Me too. It's amazing how much there's to discover about this plant. It's like it has a million different sides.
I wanted to touch on the spiritual and, I guess, mystical side of cannabis. The documentary talked about how it's been used in religious ceremonies and spiritual practices for centuries.
The handbook is great on that too. It looks at how cannabis has been used by shamans in rituals and for mystical experiences in different cultures.
It makes you wonder if cannabis could help people reach altered states of consciousness and explore their spirituality.
That's something people have been curious about for a long time, and as we learn more about consciousness, I think we'll discover even more about what cannabis can teach us about ourselves and our connection to something bigger.
This is definitely a deep dive I'm not going to forget anytime soon.
Me neither. It's been a fascinating journey through the science, history, and cultural meaning of cannabis.
So we've covered so much already, from like how cannabis affects the brain to the whole legalization debate, and even cannabis in food. But I'm thinking, how are people using cannabis in their everyday lives, like to relax or for intimacy or even when they're working out?
It's amazing how many different ways people use cannabis. The
Mm,
documentary actually shows people using it to chill out and de-stress at the end of the day.
makes sense. I know tons of people who say cannabis helps them relax and sleep better, but then some people say it helps them be more creative and focused.
Yeah, the documentary shows that too. Artists, musicians, writers using cannabis to get those creative juices flowing.
I wonder if it's like it removes a mental block or something.
Maybe. The handbook talks about how cannabinoids can change how the brain works. Attention, perception, even how we process emotions.
Wow, that's wild. But what about exercise? I've heard about athletes using cannabis to recover from workouts and manage pain.
The documentaries show that too. Athletes and people who love fitness using cannabis to have better workouts and recover faster.
Really? I never would have thought cannabis could be good for athletic performance.
Well, the handbook explains how cannabinoids can affect how we feel pain, how our muscles recover, even our energy levels.
But isn't there a chance cannabis could actually make athletic performance worse?
It's true. We need more research on that. And of course, it's important to use cannabis responsibly and follow the rules, especially in professional sports.
Totally. Safety first. Okay, switching gears a bit. Remember that Jamaican study we talked about? The one where they used cannabis to help people with crack cocaine addiction?
Oh, yeah. That one really flips the script on how we think about cannabis and addiction. It just shows how complex this issue is and how much more we need to learn about how cannabis could be used in treatment.
I also keep thinking about the risks of using cannabis. We talked about harm reduction earlier. What are some ways to be safer?
Yeah, both the documentary and the handbook stress that we got to use cannabis responsibly. They give some good advice for how to do that.
Like what?
Well, they say to start with a low dose and go slow, watch out for how it mixes with other things you might be taking, and pick a way to use it that feels right for you and your tolerance.
Makes sense. Being informed and making good choices, right?
Exactly. And everyone reacts differently to cannabis, so what works for one person might not work for another.
So you got to pay attention to how your own body feels.
Absolutely. And if you're ever not sure about something, talk to a doctor or someone who really knows about cannabis.
Speaking of knowing things, the documentary showed some really cool new technology in the cannabis world.
It's crazy how technology is changing everything about cannabis. How it's grown, how they get the good stuff out,
Mm.
how they make new products, even the whole consumer experience.
What are some examples?
Well, they showed stuff like high-tech farming, systems that grow the plants automatically, and fancy ways to extract the cannabinoids and terpenes. All this stuff is making cannabis products better, more consistent, and more efficient.
So the cannabis industry is getting more advanced and high tech all the time.
Oh, yeah. The handbook talks about this too. It seems like we're heading towards a future where you can get cannabis products that are personalized, made just for you, based on what you need and prefer.
That's kind of mind blowing. Imagine that. Cannabis products tailored to your specific health needs.
That's the goal. And researchers are working hard on it, finding new ways to use cannabis and making it safer and more effective.
This whole deep dive has been a wild ride. We've gone from the science of how cannabis works in our bodies to the whole debate about legalization and even the amazing things chefs are doing with cannabis.
It really has been quite a journey. I think the most important thing to remember is that cannabis is a plant with so many different aspects and a really long and complex history.
Yeah, it's way more complicated than what we usually hear, the simple stories in the media.
For sure, it's not just good or bad, black or white. There's so much more to it.
Well, as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from all this?
I hope they walk away with a sense of, awe at how complex cannabis is and that they stay curious and keep learning about this amazing plant.
I think that's a perfect way to end this. It's been great exploring this topic with you.
Same here. And to everyone listening, remember, knowledge is power. The more you know about cannabis, the better choices you can make about how you use it.
Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring.